Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. In the heart of Renbrook, there was a square unlike any other. Paved with ancient cobblestones, surrounded by weathered buildings, and marked by a single rusting clock tower, Ashwick Square had been the center of town for over 200 years. And yet, there was something wrong about it, something off. Because in Ashwick Square, footsteps never truly disappeared. No matter the time of day, no matter how empty the streets were, echoes of past steps still lingered. Some were soft and hurried, others were slow and dragging. But the worst were the ones that shouldn't be there at all. Footsteps that followed people home, that appeared in places no one had walked, that belonged to people who had been dead for years. The townspeople learned long ago to ignore them, to walk briskly through the square, never stopping, never listening, and above all, to never turn around. Because sometimes the echoes weren't just sounds. Sometimes, if you look back, you would see who was making them. Elliot Grayson never believed in ghost stories. As a traveling journalist, he had made a career out of debunking urban legends, exposing hoaxes, and writing articles about the irrational fears that small towns clung to. So when he arrived in Renbrook to investigate Ashwick Square, he wasn't expecting much. Locals spoke of lingering echoes, of phantom footsteps that never faded, but surely there was a logical explanation. Maybe the cobblestones were arranged in a way that amplified sound. Maybe the wind carried noises farther than it should. It was all science, or so he thought. Until his first night in the square, until he heard the footsteps that weren't his own. The square was empty. The town had gone quiet for the night, with only the occasional lantern flickering in the misty streets. Elliot stood at the center, notebook in hand, tapping his foot against the cobblestones. The sound echoed naturally, nothing strange. Then he took a step forward, and another step followed. It was distant, barely noticeable, but undeniably there. He frowned and turned. No one. He took another step. And again, an extra step followed. Not an echo. Not a repeat of his own movements. A new step, slightly delayed, slightly heavier. Elliot's pulse quickened. His logical mind fought for an explanation, but his instincts told him something wasn't right. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. Maybe someone was nearby, walking in sync with him. Maybe a gust of wind blew through the square, and suddenly, the footsteps multiplied. A dozen, no, maybe more, all around him. Soft shuffles, sharp heels, heavy boots, steps moving in every direction. His breath hitched. His own feet had stopped moving, and yet, the sounds kept going, as if the square was still alive with footsteps from the past, and as if something unseen was still walking, still waiting, still watching. Elliot turned on his heel and hurried back to his inn, his ears ringing with the sound of footsteps that weren't his own. The next morning, Elliot sought out the oldest resident of Renbrook, Margaret Holloway, a frail woman in her 90s who had lived in the town her entire life. When he asked her about the footsteps, she didn't laugh. She didn't call him foolish. She simply sighed and said, "You heard them then?" Elliot nodded. She motioned for him to sit, her wrinkled hands folding over her lap. "It's the square's memory," she said softly. "It never forgets. Every step that's ever been taken there, every person who's ever walked across those stones, their footsteps stay." Elliot swallowed hard. "But why?" he asked. Margaret's pale blue eyes darkened. "Because they were taken." Elliot's skin prickled. "Taken?" She nodded. "Long ago, when Renbrook was first built, Something wrong happened in that square. Some say a sacrifice. Others say a deal with something not meant to be understood. But whatever it was, it left a mark. She looked out the window toward the square, her voice barely a whisper. The ones who disappear, their footsteps are all that's left of them. Elliot's stomach twisted. Disappear, Margaret exhaled. Every few years, someone walks into Ashwick Square and never walks out. Elliot felt a chill crawl up his spine. And the echoes? He pressed. Margaret's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair. They're trying to warn us. Or maybe they're trying to take someone new. Elliot stayed in Renbrook longer than he had planned. He needed to understand, needed to find proof. Each night he returned to the square. Each night he listened. And on the seventh night, something changed. The footsteps weren't just echoes anymore. They were closer, louder. They circled him, a pattern forming in the sound. Then, a whisper, software, faint, right against his ear. Turn around. Elliot's heart stopped. His breath came in shallow gasps. Everything in him screamed not to look. But something wrong, urged him to obey. His muscles tensed. He turned, and he saw them. Figures, faint, shimmering, standing just beyond the fog. Some in old-fashioned coats, some in dresses stained with time, some in rags. Their faces were hollow, but their feet were moving, stepping forward, toward him, and then they reached out. Elliot stumbled back. His vision blurred. The world spun, and suddenly he was on the ground, panting, alone. The figures were gone, but the footsteps remained. And when he scrambled to his feet and ran, their sound followed him all the way home. Elliot left Renbrook the next morning. He never wrote the article, never spoke of what he saw, but the square never forgot him. Even years later, when he tried to convince himself it was just a trick of the mind, just paranoia, the echoes still reached him. Some nights as he lay awake in his city apartment, he would hear it. The sound of footsteps outside his door. And though he was too afraid to check, he always knew. They were not his own, and one day, when the time was right, they would come for him again. There is a place hidden deep within the world, whispered about in old folk tales and half-forgotten legends. A place that does not exist on any map, that no traveler ever finds intentionally. It is simply called the Crossroads. No one knows where it begins or where it ends. No two travelers have ever described it the same way. But the one truth, the one thing everyone agrees on, is this. Once you step onto the road, you will never walk the same path twice. And if you take the wrong turn, you may never leave. Nathan Carter had been driving for hours. The sun had long since set, leaving only his headlights to cut through the empty highway. His GPS had stopped working miles ago, and his phone had no signal. Still, he wasn't too worried. At worst, he had taken a wrong turn. At worst, he would have to backtrack until he found his way again. But then, the road split, not into two, not into three, but into dozens of paths, stretching in every direction. His foot hesitated over the brake. His pulse quickened. There were no signs, no markers, just endless roads, twisting into the darkness like veins on a map. He frowned, leaning forward, trying to make sense of it. Then, in his rearview mirror, the road behind him was gone. Panic settled in. Nathan swung open his car door, stepping onto the pavement. Cold night air rushed over him. He turned, expecting to see the road he had come from. But there was only more paths, as if the world had shifted while he wasn't looking. He was at a true crossroads now, a place where every road looked identical, stretching into the distance, disappearing into mist and shadow. He took a deep breath. This was just an illusion, a trick of exhaustion and night driving. He would pick a road, drive straight, and find his way back. At random, he chose the third road from the left and got back into his car. The moment his wheels touched the pavement, the other roads vanished, as if they had never been there at all, and he had no choice but to move forward. At first, the road seemed normal, silent, empty. The trees lining it were tall and dark, their branches stretching like skeletal hands toward the sky. But as he drove, something felt off. His headlights illuminated the pavement, but the road signs were blank. His odometer continued ticking, but the gas gauge never moved. And worst of all, no matter how far he drove, the scenery never changed. The same trees, the same cracks in the pavement, the same lone mailbox he had passed 20 minutes ago. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. He stopped the car, heart pounding. This wasn't possible. Had he made a circle? No, he had driven straight. Then, just as he was about to turn around, he saw it, a figure standing at the edge of his headlights. Nathan's blood ran cold. The figure was barely visible, just a dark silhouette standing at the tree line. It didn't move, didn't react, just watched. Nathan reached for his phone. No signal. He turned on his high beams. The figure was gone. A cold shiver crawled down his spine. This wasn't normal. He slammed the car into reverse, spinning the wheel. But the road behind him was gone again. Only more paths stretching endlessly into the dark. He was trapped. And then the radio crackled. Through the static, a voice whispered, "Keep going, but choose carefully." Nathan's breath caught. Then the static cut out. And the figure was back, closer this time. Standing at the very edge of the road, Nathan pressed the gas pedal hard. He didn't care where he was going anymore. He just needed to move. The road twisted, split, converged. Every mile, new paths appeared, stretching out in unnatural angles. He drove down one, then another, then another. No end, no destination. Just an endless maze of choices. And through it all, the figure followed, always at the edge of his vision, never moving, yet somehow closer each time he blinked. His hands shook on the wheel. The road wasn't real. It was a trap, and he was running out of time. Nathan had to stop. His car wasn't running out of gas, but he was. His hands were slick with sweat. His head pounded, and the paths kept changing. If he didn't choose correctly, he would never leave. His mind raced. The roads weren't random. They were guiding him, testing him. He had taken wrong turns. But what was the right one? He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. And then he listened. For the first time, he didn't look at the paths, didn't think about logic. He just felt. One path felt different, colder, quieter. He turned the wheel and drove toward it. The road stretched ahead, long and empty. Then in the distance, a light. Hope flared in Nathan's chest. He pressed the gas, his car roaring forward. Faster, faster. And then the trees parted, the night sky cleared, and suddenly he was back on a normal road, a real highway. The endless maze was gone. Nathan slammed on the brakes, gasping. He checked his phone. Service restored. His GPS working again. Relief flooded through him. He had made it out. He had escaped. But then his headlights flickered, and in the rearview mirror, at the edge of the road, a new crossroad had appeared. Dozens of paths stretching into the night, and standing among them, the figure, still watching, still waiting. And Nathan knew, with chilling certainty, he had only taken the first step. The road wasn't finished with him yet. It sat in the corner of an abandoned antique shop gathering dust. Tall, elegant, its gilded frame carved with twisting vines and hidden faces. The mirror was beautiful, yet unnerving. People who glanced at it often shuddered. They would swear just for a second that their reflection didn't move the way it should, but no one ever lingered long enough to find out why. And so it was forgotten until Eleanor Graves found it, and the whispers began. Eleanor hadn't meant to buy the mirror. She had gone into the antique shop looking for a bookshelf, something simple to fill the empty space in her new apartment. But the moment she saw it, something called to her. The mirror was different, unusual, and strangely familiar. She didn't remember ever seeing it before, but it felt like she had, like it had been waiting for her. The shopkeeper, a frail old man with tired eyes, hesitated when she asked about it. "That mirror, it's been here a long time," he murmured. "People don't usually like it." "Why not?" He didn't answer right away. Then after a pause, he said, "Mirrors show us what we want to see, but sometimes they show us what we don't." Eleanor laughed it off and bought it anyway. She should have listened. That night, Eleanor placed the mirror in her bedroom. It fit perfectly against the far wall, just across from her bed. Too tired to unpack anything else, she went to sleep almost immediately. And sometime in the middle of the night, the whispering began, software faint, like wind rustling through old paper. She stirred, half asleep. Then, Eleanor, her name. She jolted upright. The room was dark, silent. She held her breath, listening. Nothing. Just the steady tick of her clock. Her pulse slowed. It had been a dream, just a dream. But as she lay back down, eyes drifting shut, a single breath fogged up the surface of the mirror, as if something had been standing there, watching, waiting. The whispers continued. Every night, just as she was about to fall asleep, the voice would return, software insistent. "Eleanor, do you remember?" She started waking up tired, unsettled, and one night, when the whispering grew louder, she finally answered. "Remember what?" she murmured. For a moment there was only silence. Then, "Look." A chill ran through her. She turned toward the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her. But something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't perfectly synchronized. It blinked too late. Its breathing was too slow. And then it smiled. Eleanor's breath caught. She hadn't smiled. And yet there, on the glass, her reflection was grinning. Wide, too wide. And then it whispered, "I remember everything." Eleanor stopped sleeping. Every night, the mirror whispered secrets she didn't remember. It told her things about her childhood, about places she had never been, about people she had never met. It spoke of locked doors and hidden rooms, of memories buried deep. And the longer she listened, the more she began to remember. A house in the woods, a fire, a little girl's screams. She woke up gasping. What was happening to her? Had she forgotten something? Or was the mirror lying? She had to find out. Digging through old records, Eleanor found something impossible. A house, a fire, a missing girl. It had happened 20 years ago. A young girl had vanished after a fire burned down a secluded home in the countryside. Only one survivor had been found, a 4-year-old girl. Her name, Eleanor Graves. Her hands shook. She had been adopted after that fire. She had never known the truth. But the mirror, it remembered, and it had been waiting for her. That night, when the whispers returned, Eleanor faced the mirror. "Who are you?" she demanded. Her reflection tilted its head. Then it whispered, "I am what was left behind." Her pulse pounded. Left behind where? Her reflection lifted its hand and pointed, not at her, at the back of the mirror. Something twisted inside her. Heart hammering, she grabbed the frame, pulling it away from the wall. Dust, cobwebs, and then her breath caught. because carved into the wood was a name, not hers, but someone else's. Clara Graves. She staggered back. Clara, her twin sister, the girl who had died in the fire. She had never been told. She had never known. But the mirror had never forgotten. And now, neither could she. Eleanor moved the mirror into the attic the next day. She couldn't bring herself to destroy it. Somehow it felt wrong, like burying a body without saying goodbye. The whispers grew softer after that, fainter, less like a voice, more like a memory. And sometimes late at night, when the house was silent, she would wake up and see a faint breath of fog on the mirror's surface, as if someone was still standing there, still waiting, still remembering. And deep in the quiet, the mirror would whisper, "You are not alone." There is a place hidden in the countryside, far from roads and far from maps, a hill that shouldn't exist. On bright summer days, its grass glows a shade too green. On cold winter mornings, frost never settles on its surface. And no matter where the sun is in the sky, the shadows on that hill always fall the wrong way. At first, people thought it was a trick of the light. Then they stopped going there altogether, because some shadows don't belong to anything at all. Elliot Carter had spent years chasing unsolved mysteries, abandoned towns, forgotten places, eerie local legends. He had seen them all, or so he thought. Then he heard about Black Hollow Hill. The locals refused to speak about it. Those who did only whispered, voice low, as if afraid something might hear. "The shadows aren't right," an old woman at the gas station had muttered. "They move when they shouldn't, and some of them don't move at all." "What do you mean?" Elliot had pressed. She only shook her head. "You'll see." So of course he went. He always went. That was his first mistake. The hill wasn't easy to find. Even with coordinates, even with a map, the trail leading to it twisted and turned. Longer than it should have been. By the time Elliot arrived, the sun was already low in the sky. At first it looked normal, just a hill covered in tall grass, swaying gently in the wind. But then he saw it, the shadows. They stretched in the wrong direction. The sun was setting behind him, but the long shadows of the grass leaned toward the light. His own shadow did the same. He lifted his arm. His shadow lifted the wrong one. A mirror image. His stomach twisted. This wasn't just a trick of the light. Something about this place was wrong. And then he noticed. There were more shadows than there should be. Some of them weren't attached to anything at all. Elliot took a step forward. The grass rustled beneath his feet. His shadow didn't move. The air grew colder. The wind stopped. He turned slowly. And that's when he saw them. Figures standing near the crest of the hill. Dark, featureless, motionless. Just shadows. No faces, no bodies. Just dark shapes cast on the ground where no one stood. Elliot's breath hitched. His heart slammed against his ribs. He took a step back, and the shadows turned toward him. Elliot ran, down the hill, through the trees, heart pounding in his ears. The dirt path twisted and shifted beneath him. His feet kicked up dust, but the dust had no shadow. The trees stretched high above, but their branches cast no silhouettes. Only the shadows of the figures remained, long, unmoving, following. Then, footsteps, not his own. They were too close, too many. He turned his head and saw his own shadow running beside him, but it wasn't his anymore. It was faster, catching up, reaching. Elliot screamed. Somehow he made it back to his car. He threw himself inside, gasping, hands trembling as he turned the key. The engine roared to life. He slammed the gas pedal. The tires spun and the car lurched forward. He didn't stop driving until he saw streetlights again. Didn't stop until the shadows on the pavement fell the right way. Only then did he pull over, hands gripping the wheel, breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, everything was silent, normal. Then, in his rearview mirror, a shadow moved on its own. Not his, not attached to anything at all. And in the dim glow of his taillights, it smiled. Elliot never went back to Black Hollow Hill. He never spoke about it, never wrote about it. But something had followed him. At night, he would wake up and find his shadow facing the wrong way. Sometimes in photographs, there were too many silhouettes. And sometimes, when he looked in the mirror, his reflection didn't move at all, as if it was waiting, because the hill never lets go, and the shadows always find their way home. Some books tell stories, some books hold knowledge, but there is one book that does something else. It does not teach, it does not entertain, it erases. A book of names, written in ink as dark as the void, bound in leather that feels too much like skin. And whoever reads their own name within its pages vanishes, not just from the world, from memory, from time, as if they had never existed at all. Elias Holloway was a seeker of lost things, ancient books, forbidden texts, whispers of the past. So when he heard about a hidden library deep in the countryside, he knew he had to find it. The locals called it the Hollow Archive, a place where books that should have been burned were kept instead, books that held secrets too dangerous to be read. "There's a book there," an old scholar had told him, voice hushed. "A book that takes instead of gives, a book of names." "What does it do?" Elias had asked. The man had only shivered. "No one knows, because those who read it," a pause, "are never heard from again." Elias had laughed at the time. He wasn't laughing now, because he had found the library, and the book was waiting. The Hollow Archive was buried in dust and silence. Shelves stretched endlessly in the gloom, stacked with books no one should have kept. Elias searched for hours, and then, on a forgotten table, half buried in parchment and cobwebs, he saw it. A book with no title. Its cover was dark, smooth, too smooth, like polished bone. His fingers tingled as he reached for it. A voice in his head whispered, "Don't." He ignored it. The moment he touched the cover, he heard a breath that wasn't his own, and the book opened by itself. The pages were black as ink, the words written in a language Elias didn't recognize. Then, as he turned the pages, the text shifted, letters twisted, melted, and formed words in his own handwriting. His breath caught, because on the page before him was a list of names, names he knew, names he didn't, and at the very bottom, one more name began to appear, his own. Elias Holloway. A shiver ran through him. Something in the room shifted. The shadows deepened. The silence grew too heavy. And suddenly, he couldn't remember why he was here. Elias staggered back from the book, breath sharp. His hands shook. His thoughts felt foggy. What was I doing? The name in the book gleamed, and something inside him pulled. His mind blurred. Flashes of memory. His home, his family, his own name. But they were distant, slipping through his grasp, like they weren't his at all. His heart pounded. "I have to get out." He turned to run, but his legs wouldn't move, because the shadows had grown too long, and they were reaching for him. A whisper filled the air. "You read your name." The shadows coiled around his limbs, cold, hungry, tugging him toward the open pages. "No!" He thrashed, but his body was fading. His hands blurred. His voice diminished. And then, the door burst open. A figure stood there, cloaked in dust and light. An old woman, sharp eyes, a shaking hand gripping a red candle. The flame flickered, and the shadows recoiled. With one swift motion, she slammed the book shut. Elias collapsed, and the whispers stopped. When Elias woke, the library was empty. The woman was gone. The book was gone. But something was wrong. He knew his name. He knew who he was. But when he returned home, no one else did. His apartment was gone. His friends didn't recognize him. His own reflection in the mirror looked uncertain, like it was trying to remember itself. The book had erased him, not completely, but enough. And in the deep corners of his mind, he could still hear the whisper. Your name is still written, and one day, the book will call you back. Elias spent years searching for the book again, but it was always one step ahead, moving from place to place, appearing in forgotten libraries, antique shops, old attics, and every so often, someone else finds it, a stranger, a curious soul, and they turn the pages, and they see their own name, and then they are gone, their homes empty, their existence unwritten, and the book moves on. There is a fountain hidden deep in the heart of an ancient city. It does not sparkle under the sun. Its water does not ripple with the wind. Instead, it whispers. No one knows who built it. No one knows how long it has been there. But those who lean close enough to listen never leave unchanged. Because the fountain does not speak of ordinary things. It tells secrets. The kind of secrets that should have died with their keepers. The kind of secrets that were meant to be forgotten. Silas Moreau had spent his life chasing legends. Ancient artifacts, forgotten ruins, whispers of the past. But the moment he arrived in the city of Vedrine, he knew this was different. The city was old, too old. Its streets were lined with stone buildings that had stood for centuries. Its people spoke in hushed voices, as if afraid the walls could hear them. And at the heart of it all, a square that no one entered, a fountain that no one approached. Stay away from the water, the innkeeper warned. It speaks of things best left buried. What kind of thing? Silas had asked. The man only shook his head. The kind that make people disappear. Silas didn't listen. That was his first mistake. It was midnight when Silas finally stood before the fountain. It was nothing like he expected. The stone was cracked and darkened, covered in creeping ivy. No coins lay at the bottom. No birds drank from its surface. The water was still, unnaturally so. Then, a whisper, software murmuring, like breath against his ear. Silas froze. The words were too faint to understand, but they were there, coming from the water. He leaned closer, and the fountain spoke his name. Silas stumbled back, his breath sharp, but the whisper did not stop. More voices rose, some urgent, some laughing, some weeping. You seek answers, one voice murmured. So many have before you. But secrets have a cost, another hissed. Are you willing to pay? Silas swallowed. What are you? He whispered. For a moment, there was silence. Then the water moved, a single ripple, and then another, and within the shifting surface, Silas saw faces, hundreds of them, eyes wide, mouths forming silent screams, drowning over and over again. We were once like you, the fountain whispered, seekers of truth, keepers of knowledge. But we listened too closely, and now we are part of it. Silas turned to run, but the whispers followed him. We know what lies beneath the city. We know the king's final betrayal. We know the gods that were buried here, still restless in their stone tombs. Do you wish to know too? The air grew heavy, the city felt smaller, and a terrible thought crawled into his mind. What if the whispers were true? What if there were things hidden beneath Vedrine that no one else knew? What if he could uncover them? His heart pounded, his breath quickened. Just one secret, he whispered back. Tell me one. The water shuddered, and the fountain spoke. The words that filled the air were not meant for human ears. A name, not of a man, but of something older. Something that had been buried beneath Vedrine for centuries. a being that should not wake. And as soon as Silas heard it, he knew he had doomed himself, because some secrets do not stay whispered. Some secrets wake up. The ground shook, the wind howled, and beneath the city, something moved, something stirred, and it was listening. Silas ran through the silent streets, past the empty houses. But the whispers chased him. They filled his mind, his bones, his blood. He could feel the truth clawing at him, trying to rewrite him. He had heard a name that should have remained unspoken, and now the city knew, and the city would erase him. By the time the sun rose, Silas Moreau was gone. No records, no memories, not even a footprint left behind. Only the fountain remained, and when the next stranger arrived, the whispers began again. Because Vedrine has always kept its secrets, and the fountain never runs dry. At the end of a long, winding road stood a house, not abandoned, not lived in, just there. Its windows always gleamed, its bulbs never flickered. Even in the deepest hours of the night, the house glowed. No one in town knew who owned it. No one could remember a time when it wasn't there. And no one, not a single person, had ever seen it go dark. Because the lights in that house weren't just lights. They were something else. Something that had never stopped watching. Elliot Grayson was the kind of man who asked too many questions. A journalist by trade, an investigator by obsession. So when he first heard of the house that never darkened, he thought it was a joke, a local legend. Lights don't stay on forever, he had scoffed. Eventually, something burns out. But the bartender had only shaken his head. Not these. Elliot should have stopped there, but he never did. That was his first mistake. It took him 3 days to find the house. It stood alone at the top of a hill, untouched by time. The curtains never moved, the bulbs never dimmed. Even the porch light, pale and humming, glowed in the early evening. Elliot walked up the steps, knocked once, then twice, nothing. He tried the doorknob, it turned, and the door opened by itself. Inside, the air was warm, too warm, like a body that had been trapped in a room for too long. The walls buzzed, not with electricity, with something else. The lights above flickered, not from weakness, but from movement, something shifting inside them, watching him. Elliot took a step forward. The door shut behind him, and in that moment, he realized there were no light switches. Every room was lit, yet wrong. The lampshades cast shadows in places they shouldn't. Some stretched too far, some didn't stretch at all. In the living room, a single chair faced a blank television. The screen was off, but its glow remained. In the kitchen, the oven light was on. The clock above it read 0000, frozen, as if time had stopped here, as if the house itself didn't understand what darkness was. And then, from the hallway, a shadow moved, not cast by anything at all. Just there, waiting. Elliot's pulse pounded. His skin felt hot. The lights weren't just watching him, they were studying him. He turned toward the hallway mirror. His reflection wasn't his. It stood still, staring back, and then it blinked. He stumbled backward, heart racing. Somewhere above, the light bulbs flickered faster. The ceiling hummed, louder, angrier. Then, a voice, software cracking. "You shouldn't be here." Elliot turned, but the hallway was empty. No one there. Just the lights, just the glow. He felt something in the air, not quite heat, not quite sound. Something alive, something that knew him now. And then he understood. The house had never been empty. It had been waiting for someone to enter, for someone to stay. And those who did never left. Not really. Elliot tried to run, but the house shifted. The doors stretched farther away. The rooms blurred. The walls glowed brighter. Too bright, painfully bright. And in that light, he saw them. Figures, faces trapped inside the bulbs. Silent, eyes wide, mouths open, but unable to scream. Their shadows still stood in the rooms, still moved when the light flickered, still walked, still sat, still stared at blank television screens, still waited, because the house had taken them, and now it wanted him. Elliot fought, ran, threw himself at the door. It opened. He stumbled out, into the night, away from the glow. But even as he gasped for breath, the lights in the house never flickered, never dimmed. And the next night, they still shone, because the house was never empty. And somewhere deep inside, in a bulb that buzzed softly, a new shadow waited, watching, waiting for the next guest to enter. Because the lights in that house never go out, and neither do the ones trapped inside them. Some places exist only when the world is asleep. Some roads are meant to be forgotten. This road is neither. It is always there, waiting in the space between dreams and memory. A long stretch of cracked pavement, shrouded in mist. It does not lead to a city. It does not lead to home. It leads to something else. And once you have walked it, even in sleep, it will never stop calling you back. Because the road does not simply exist in nightmares. The road is the nightmare. And eventually, it will become your reality. The first time Isaac Montgomery saw the road, he thought it was just a dream. A strange, unsettling dream, but nothing more. He had been standing on pavement, his breath fogging in the cold air. The road stretched ahead into thick mist, the edges vanishing into darkness. There were no signs, no streetlights, no sound except for the faintest whisper of wind. Then, the footsteps, not his own, not echoing. Something else was there, something watching. He had turned his head and woke up before he could see it. Most nightmares fade with the morning light. This one didn't. All day, the memory of that road clung to Isaac's mind. Something about it felt too real. The way the air had been so cold, it bit at his skin. The way the silence had pressed in around him. The way the footsteps had stopped just before he turned. That night, when he closed his eyes, the road was waiting. The same stretch of pavement, the same fog curling at the edges. Only this time, the silence was deeper. The air was thicker, and he could feel it now. The presence just beyond the mist. Something just out of sight. Something waiting. He tried to move, tried to step forward, but the moment his foot touched the ground, the whispering began. Faint, distant, but growing closer. Isaac turned, his heart pounding. Something moved in the fog, a shadow stretching toward him, and then he woke up. Isaac sat up in bed, gasping. His sheets were damp with sweat. His room was dark, silent, but something felt off. His feet were cold. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed and froze. The floor wasn't carpet, it was pavement. He yanked his feet back onto the bed, his breath sharp. He forced himself to look again. The carpet was there. The room was normal. But for a few terrifying seconds, it hadn't been. Isaac didn't sleep the rest of the night, but the next night, the dream came back. This time, when Isaac stepped onto the road, he felt heavier, like something was pulling him down. The air was colder than before. The fog had thickened. And then he saw it, a signpost standing by the roadside. It hadn't been there before. It was old, the wood warped and splintered. And though the sign itself was blank, there were deep scratches in the wood, scratches that looked almost like letters. Isaac stepped closer, his fingers hovering over the rough surface. Something about it called to him. He touched it. Pain lanced through his skull. Visions. A woman running, breathless, desperate, something chasing her. A scream, then darkness. Isaac yanked his hand away, his own breath ragged. And when he looked again, the scratches on the sign had changed. Now they formed a single word. Run! Isaac spun around, his pulse hammering. The road stretched endlessly in both directions. The fog swirled unnaturally, curling toward him like living hands. And then, the whispering started again, louder this time. He's here now. He's walking the road. He should not have stayed this long. Isaac's breath turned to ice. The whispers were close, too close. Shapes moved in the mist, tall, thin, not quite human. One of them stepped forward. Isaac turned and ran. His feet pounded against the pavement. The road stretched into eternity. No turns, no exits. Only the endless, suffocating fog. Behind him, the whispers grew louder. The shapes moved faster. The road felt wrong beneath his feet. Like it wasn't solid. Like it was shifting, changing. Isaac ran harder. Then, a door. Standing alone in the middle of the road. A way out. He reached for the handle. Something grabbed his wrist. A voice rasped in his ear. "You don't get to leave." Isaac yanked free, threw the door open, and everything went black. Isaac's eyes snapped open. His room, his bed, his heart still racing. But as he sat there gasping, the room felt different. Too quiet, too still. Then he noticed. His window was covered in fog, a thick, unnatural mist swirling against the glass. His breath caught in his throat. And then he saw the reflection, a signpost, standing in the middle of his room. Scratched into the wood was a new message. "You never left." Isaac turned sharply, but there was nothing there, just his empty room. But the fog outside the window was getting thicker, and from the hallway beyond his bedroom door, he heard it, a single, slow footstep. The road hadn't just followed him into his dreams. It had followed him into the waking world, and now it was waiting for him to walk it again. In the quiet town of Blackwood, where the fog rolled in thick from the hills and the streets smelled of damp earth and old stone, there stood a statue. No one knew exactly when it had been placed there. No plaque, no artist's signature, just a life-size figure of a man, carved from weathered gray stone, standing in the center of Hawthorne Square. His posture was simple, hands folded behind his back, head slightly tilted, as if listening to something no one else could hear. For decades, the townspeople had grown used to its presence. But then, it started to move. Every morning, without fail, the statue would be in a different position. Some days it was at the fountain's edge, gazing into the water. Other days it stood near the old church, facing the heavy wooden doors. Once, it had even turned to face the mayor's office, as if watching the people inside. At first, the townspeople laughed it off. Pranksters, they said, some teenagers having fun. But then, they locked the gates around it, set up cameras, even posted a night guard. And still, every morning, the statue moved, and no one ever saw it happen. Daniel Hayes was not the type to believe in superstitions. As Blackwood's youngest journalist, he prided himself on logic. He had written articles debunking ghost stories, exposing hoaxes, and even proving that the so-called haunted house on Hollow Street was just an abandoned property filled with raccoons. So when he was assigned to cover the mystery of the statue, he took it as a joke, until the first morning he saw it move for himself. The night before, he had stood in the square, notebook in hand, watching as the town officials locked the iron gates around the statue. He had taken photos, marked its exact position, even set up his own hidden camera just in case. And yet, when he returned at dawn, the statue was gone. Not just moved, gone. The iron gates were still locked, the padlock still in place, but the stone figure had vanished. For a long moment, Daniel stood frozen. Then a voice, small, shaky, called out from behind him. "Mister, it's over here." Daniel turned. A little girl, no older than 7, stood near the bakery, pointing. And when he followed her gaze, his stomach dropped. The statue now stood at the edge of the square, facing the town hall, hands folded, head tilted, watching. The town buzzed with whispers. The statue's movements had always been unsettling, but this was different. It had disappeared, reappeared, without a trace. The mayor ordered an investigation. The police checked the camera footage. Nothing. Not a single frame showed it moving. 1 second it was in the square, the next gone. And then it got worse. The next morning it had moved again, this time to the very edge of town, standing at the entrance of Blackwood Cemetery, watching, waiting. And that was when the first person disappeared. Eleanor Finch had lived in Blackwood all her life. A widow, a mother of 3, a librarian who had spent her days lost in books. And then, one morning, she was gone. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle, just vanished. The only thing out of place? Her front door had been left wide open, as if she had walked out willingly, as if she had followed something. And when the townspeople gathered in the square that morning, the statue had moved again. This time, it stood directly in front of the library, its stone face tilted downward, as if peering into the building. The people began to whisper. Daniel felt cold all over. It was choosing, one by one. Determined to solve the mystery, Daniel did something reckless. He stayed in the square alone that night. No cameras, no tricks. Just him and the statue, watching, waiting. The fog rolled in thick, curling around the lamplights like ghostly fingers. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. And then he heard it, a low grinding sound, like stone scraping against stone. Daniel's heart hammered. He turned slowly. And the statue was no longer where it had been. It stood right behind him, close enough to touch, close enough to breathe. He stumbled back, his breath ragged. The statue's head was tilted downward, staring at him. And then it moved, right before his eyes. Its stone fingers unfolded. Its mouth, its once sealed mouth, opened, and a whisper so faint it barely reached his ears, drifted through the fog. "You see now." Daniel couldn't move, couldn't breathe, because he did see. The truth crashed into him like a wave. The statue wasn't just moving, it was hunting, and he was next. Daniel never told anyone what he saw that night, because the next morning, when the town awoke, the statue was standing at his front door, waiting. It did not move again for days, and when it finally did, it was found back in Hawthorne Square, where it had always stood, as if it had never left, as if it had never chosen. The disappearances stopped. The town breathed again. But Daniel knew better, because sometimes late at night, when he walked through the empty streets, past the quiet square, he could feel its gaze. Even now, standing frozen in place, its stone hands folded, its head tilted ever so slightly, it was watching. And one day when the time was right, it would move again. At the end of a long-forgotten hallway, deep within the abandoned Ashford Manor, there was a door with no handle, no hinges, just a keyhole, perfectly round, perfectly smooth, set into the wood like an eye waiting to be peered through. No one knew where it led. No blueprints mentioned it. No records confirmed its existence. But those who looked through the keyhole, they never spoke of what they saw, because some things are not meant to be glimpsed, and some doors should never be opened. Hannah Vale never believed in ghost stories. As a historian and researcher, she prided herself on separating fact from fiction. That's why when she was invited to document the ruins of Ashford Manor, she didn't hesitate. The mansion had been abandoned for over a century, its original owners long forgotten, its halls left to crumble beneath time's weight. She had expected dust and decay. She had not expected the door. Hannah had been exploring for hours, carefully taking notes, sketching details of the old architecture. Then she found the hallway. It wasn't on the original floor plans. It wasn't on any records. But there it was, narrow, stretching into the dim light. Its walls lined with faded wallpaper. And at the very end, the door. It was strange, seamless, as if it had been built into the house rather than added later. And then there was the keyhole. It shouldn't have been remarkable, but something about it felt wrong, like it was waiting. Hannah hesitated. Then curiosity won. She leaned forward, placing her eye against the cold brass. And the world changed. It wasn't dark on the other side. That was the first shock. She had expected emptiness, maybe just the other side of the wall. Instead, she saw a city, not like any city she had ever known. Buildings of smooth black stone rose into a sky too vast to be real, filled with stars that pulsed like living hearts. The streets were lined with glowing sigils, their meaning unknown. And then, they appeared, figures in dark robes, faceless, moving in patterns too precise to be random. Hannah's breath caught. They weren't walking. They were performing something, a ritual, a summoning. Then one of them stopped, turned, faceless, yet aware, looking right at her, and then, in perfect silence, it moved toward the keyhole. Hannah jerked back. Her breath came in sharp gasps. Her hands shook. The keyhole stared back, empty, as if nothing had happened. But she knew. Something had seen her, and now it knew she existed. Hannah tried to leave, but Ashford Manor had changed. The hallways twisted. Doors that had been open were now sealed shut. The air felt different, heavy, like the entire house was watching her. And then she heard it, a sound that should not have been possible. A knock, software rhythmic, coming from the other side of the door. Her breath hitched. She backed away, but the knocking followed her, growing louder, more urgent. Then a whisper, so close it brushed against her ear. "Let us in!" Hannah ran. She didn't remember making it out of Ashford Manor. One moment, she was sprinting through darkened corridors. The next, she was outside, gasping in the cool night air. But the escape hadn't freed her, because now, every door she passed, every keyhole she saw, she felt something on the other side, watching, waiting. And then one morning, she found it, on her bedside table, a key, old, ornate, and somehow familiar. She knew without question where it belonged, and she knew with a sinking dread. One day she would use it, because the city beyond the keyhole was still there, still waiting, and it wanted her to come back. Deep in the heart of Blackthorn Forest, hidden from trails and untouched by maps, lies a pond unlike any other. Its waters are still unnaturally so, never disturbed by wind or rain. No birds drink from it. No fish swim beneath its surface. And yet, if you look into its depths, you will not see your own reflection. You will see something else, a vision of the future. Some come seeking answers, others come seeking power, but few leave unchanged, because the pond does not simply show what will come, it decides what must be. And once it reveals your fate, there is no turning back. Lena Whitaker had always been skeptical of legends. Growing up in the sleepy town of Hollow Bend, she had heard all the old stories about Blackthorn Forest, the whispers of ancient magic, of spirits that watch from the trees, of the pond that could see the future. But legends were just that, stories. Or at least she had thought so, until the night her mother disappeared. One moment Evelyn Whitaker had been standing in their small kitchen, humming as she washed dishes. The next she was gone. No sign of a struggle, no footprints leading away from the house, just vanished. The only clue? A single note written in her mother's familiar handwriting. "If you want to find me, look into the water." Lena had read the words 100 times, her hands shaking. She knew what it meant. Her mother had gone to the pond, and if she wanted answers, she would have to follow. The journey into Blackthorn Forest was not easy. The deeper Lena walked, the more the trees seemed to close in around her, swallowing the light. She checked her phone, no signal. Branches snagged at her jacket, roots threatened to trip her, but she pushed forward. Then, the forest fell silent. No rustling leaves, no distant hoots of owls, not even the sound of her own footsteps. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then she saw it, the pond. It was smaller than she had expected, no wider than a backyard swimming pool. But its surface, it was like a mirror. Lena approached cautiously. The water was too still, as if it were frozen in time. She leaned forward, staring into the depths. And the moment her eyes met the surface, the world changed. It was like falling into a dream. The reflection beneath the water shifted, and suddenly Lena was no longer in the forest. She was in a house, not hers, not anywhere she recognized. The air smelled of old wood and something sweet, like vanilla and cinnamon. A woman stood by a window, her back turned. Lena's heart stopped. Her mother. She was alive. But before Lena could call out, the vision shifted. The walls darkened. The warm glow of the house flickered, and something else appeared. A shadow. Not a person. Not an animal. Something wrong. It loomed behind her mother, reaching. Lena's breath caught. Then the vision snapped. She was back in the forest, her hands gripping the earth. The pond's surface rippled, as if laughing at her. Lena's body shook. Her mother was alive, for now. But something was coming for her, and Lena only had one chance to stop it. She had to find that house. But how? The pond had shown her the future, but no location. Then she saw it. The edges of the vision, barely noticeable at first. A name carved into the wooden frame of the door in the reflection, Ashwood House. Lena's stomach dropped. She knew that name. It was the abandoned house on the other side of town, the one no one ever spoke about. Whispers said it had been home to a reclusive woman, one who had dabbled in dark magic. Some claimed she had cursed herself. Others said she had simply vanished. And now Lena's mother was there, waiting, or worse, trapped. Lena turned from the pond. She had what she needed, and before the night was over, she would know the truth. Ashwood House stood at the edge of town, long forgotten. Its windows were cracked, its porch sagging with age. Lena didn't hesitate. She shoved the door open, stepping inside. Dust choked the air. Moonlight spilled through broken slats in the roof. And then, a whisper, software close. "Lena!" She froze. The voice was her mother's. She turned, heart pounding. There, in the shadows, her mother. Pale, tired, but alive. Lena ran to her, pulling her close. But the moment she touched her, the air went cold. A presence filled the room. The shadow from the vision. It rose from the corners, its form twisting. It had no eyes, but Lena felt it watching. And then, it spoke. "You should not have seen." Lena's breath hitched. The pond. It had not just shown her the future, it had set it in motion. She had caused this. The shadow moved closer, tendrils of darkness curling around her mother's body. Lena refused to let it take her. She grabbed the closest thing she could, a rusted lantern by the fireplace. With a cry, she swung it. The glass shattered, flames roared, the shadow screamed, and the world exploded in fire and light. When Lena opened her eyes, the house was gone. No ashes, no ruins, as if it had never been there. Her mother lay beside her, unconscious but breathing, alive. Lena exhaled, pressing her forehead to the earth. The future had been changed. But at what cost? She turned back toward the forest. Somewhere in its depths, the pond still waited, still showing futures, still setting them into motion. Lena knew she should warn people, tell them to stay away, but she also knew the truth. The pond did not care for warnings. It would always find those who sought it, and some futures could never be escaped. There are bridges built of stone, bridges built of wood, and then there are bridges built of something else, something that does not rot, does not crack, does not wear with time, but instead takes. There is a bridge deep in the forest of Raven's Hollow. No map marks its location, and no road leads to it. But wander long enough, and you may find yourself standing before it. Its planks gleam like polished obsidian, the railings smooth and cold to the touch. There is no river beneath it, no gorge, no reason for it to exist at all. And yet, it stretches into the mist, disappearing into a place no traveler has ever returned from unchanged. For to cross this bridge, you must pay a toll, but it does not take coins. It takes memories. And the farther you walk, the more you forget. Jonah Hayes had been walking for hours, or had it been days? Time had begun to slip through his fingers like sand. He hadn't meant to stray so far from the hiking trail, but something had pulled him deeper into the woods. A whisper in the wind, a feeling in his chest. And then he found it, a bridge appearing out of the mist like a dream or a trap. Jonah hesitated at the threshold. His instincts screamed at him to turn around. But something about the bridge felt familiar, as if he had been here before, as if it was waiting for him. He stepped forward, and the moment his foot touched the first plank, a voice echoed through the fog. "What will you give?" Jonah's heart pounded. He spun around, but the woods behind him were gone, swallowed by mist. There was no way back. The bridge stretched ahead, endless. His only path was forward. A soft wind curled around him, carrying whispers he couldn't quite understand. And then, a sharp tug in his chest, like something being pulled from him. He gasped. A memory was gone. He didn't know which one, only that something had been taken. He tried to recall his childhood home and found nothing but a blank space where it should have been. Jonah staggered. The bridge demanded payment, and he had just paid the first toll. The farther he walked, the more he lost. The name of his first pet, the sound of his mother's voice, the face of his best friend. Each step stole another piece of him, slipping away into the mist. And yet, Jonah couldn't stop, because ahead, just barely visible through the fog, was something. A figure standing at the far end of the bridge, waiting. He pushed forward, desperate to reach it. The bridge trembled beneath his feet. The whispers grew louder. Memories unraveled from his mind like threads being pulled from a tapestry. His first kiss, his childhood dreams, his own birthday. By the time he reached the figure, he no longer remembered his own name. The figure stood in the mist, motionless. A tall man draped in robes as black as the void beneath the bridge. His face was hidden, but his voice was ancient. "You have paid the toll," the keeper said. Jonah swallowed hard. Who am I?" The keeper did not answer. Instead, he extended a hand. Jonah hesitated. "I don't understand," he whispered. "You asked for passage," the keeper said, "and you have given your price." Jonah's heart ached with something he could not name. His past was gone. His identity was a hollow shell. He had given everything. But for what? "What's on the other side?" Jonah asked. The keeper's voice was almost gentle. "The place where the forgotten go." Jonah's breath hitched. "And if I turned back?" The keeper tilted his head. "Would you even know where to return?" Jonah tried to remember his life before the bridge, tried to recall his reason for coming here, but there was nothing, only emptiness, and the soft, beckoning call of the other side. Jonah took the keeper's hand, and together they stepped beyond the bridge, into the mist. No one knows what lies beyond the bridge. No one who has crossed has ever returned to tell the tale. But the bridge remains, silent, waiting. Sometimes in the dead of night, lost travelers find themselves standing before it. And if they listen closely, they may hear the whispers of those who walked it before. Faint voices in the fog, calling for names they no longer remember, begging to be found, but no one ever does. For the bridge does not just take memories, it takes people too. And once it has you, you are never seen again. There is a place that no maps record, a village that no traveler has ever found by day. Its name is Eventide. The stories say it does not exist under the sun. No roads lead to it, no signs point the way. But at night, when the last rays of light sink beyond the hills, the village appears. Its streets glow with lantern light. Its houses flicker into being like ghosts remembering their shapes. And the villagers, they emerge as if they had always been there, living, laughing, waiting. But if the morning catches you inside Eventide, you will never find your way out. Because at dawn, the village disappears, and so do the people trapped within it. Elias Carter never believed in ghost stories. He was a historian, a seeker of facts, a man who dealt in reality, not legends. So when he heard of the night village, he dismissed it as another folktale, one of those eerie bedtime stories meant to keep travelers wary of the woods. But then he found the map. It was buried in the archives of an old university library, half rotted, the ink faded. Yet beneath the damage, one thing stood out, a place labeled Eventide, and beneath it, a single note scrawled in shaking handwriting, only after sunset. Elias' curiosity burned. How could a village appear only at night? Was it a metaphor? A lost settlement? He had to find out. So he packed a bag, took his lantern, and set off toward the valley where the map claimed the village once stood. He hiked all day, searching, but he found nothing, just endless rolling hills and thick silent forest. By the time the sun began to set, Elias was ready to admit defeat. But then, something changed. The air thickened. The trees shifted in a way he couldn't explain, like shadows stretching in the wrong direction. Then, he saw the lights, faint at first, flickering between the trees, then brighter. Lanterns lining a cobbled road that had not been there before, and beyond them, a village, where there had been nothing but empty land hours before. Eventide. It was real. Elias stepped onto the cobbled street, his heart hammering. Everything looked new, as if the buildings had been standing for only moments. The air smelled of wood smoke and fresh bread. The streets were full of people, men, women, children, all dressed in clothing that did not match any era Elias recognized. It was as if they belonged to no time at all. A woman noticed him and smiled. "Traveler, welcome." Elias hesitated. "Where am I?" The woman laughed. "Eventide, of course. You arrived just in time for the festival." She gestured to the town square, where people danced beneath ribbons of lantern light. Music played, distant yet strangely close, as if the air itself carried the sound. It felt perfect, too perfect. Elias glanced at his watch. 10:34 p.m. The village was alive, vibrant. But something was wrong. He looked around. There were no clocks, no watches on the villagers' wrists, no sundials, no way to tell time, as if they did not want to know how close dawn was. An old man sat alone near the edge of the festival, his gaze locked on Elias. Unlike the others, he did not smile. Elias approached. "Do you know what this place is?" Elias asked. The old man exhaled. "A prison." Elias stiffened. "What do you mean?" The man's hands trembled. "You must leave before dawn," he whispered. Elias frowned. "Why?" The old man grabbed his wrist, his grip strong. "Because when the sun rises, the village disappears." Elias' breath caught. The old man's voice dropped lower. "And anyone still inside vanishes with it." Elias pulled away. "That's ridiculous." The old man's expression was grim. "Look around you, boy. Have you ever seen these people outside this village? Have you ever heard anyone say they left?" Elias's skin went cold. A sick feeling grew in his stomach, because the old man was right. No one had mentioned the outside world. They only talked about Eventide, as if it was the only place they had ever known, and always would be. Elias turned, ready to leave. But the cobbled street he had entered from was gone. In its place was a solid wall of fog, thick, unmoving. He took a step toward it, and the moment his foot crossed the threshold, a sharp pain shot through his body, like icy needles piercing his veins. He staggered back, gasping. "You can't leave yet," a voice murmured behind him. Elias spun. The villagers stood still, no longer smiling. Their faces were empty, as if their eyes were glass, watching, waiting. The woman from before stepped forward, tilting her head. "The doors don't open until morning," she said. "But don't worry." Her smile widened. "You'll learn to love it here." Elias' pulse pounded. He turned to the old man, but his seat was empty, as if he had never been there. Elias ran, through the streets, past the houses, searching for any way out. But the fog surrounded everything, trapping him inside. Then, a thought struck him. The old man had known the truth. Where had he gone? Elias rushed to where the man had sat and noticed something beneath the chair. A key, rusty, ancient. He grabbed it. It was ice cold. He turned and saw one door that was closed, the only one in the village, marked with a symbol he didn't recognize. A final chance. Elias ran to it, jammed the key into the lock, twisted. The door swung open, and behind it, a field bathed in morning light, the real world. He lunged through, and the instant his foot touched the grass, Eventide vanished. The village, the people, everything, as if it had never been there at all. Elias collapsed, gasping. He checked his watch. 5:59 a.m., 1 minute before dawn. He had made it. Barely. He turned back. But the village was gone. Only the empty valley remained. And yet, as the sun rose, he swore he still heard the distant echo of laughter, waiting for night to fall again, and for the next traveler to wander inside. There is a legend in Briar Hollow, a tale as old as the valley itself, passed down through generations. On nights when the mist rolls thick across the fields, when the air hums with an eerie stillness, those who listen closely might hear it. The thunder of hooves. The sound comes from nowhere and everywhere at once, echoing through the hills, faster than any living beast should run. But there is no rider, no form to be seen, only the mist stirring in its wake, parting as if something unseen charges through. The locals call it the phantom horse. Some say it is an omen, foretelling tragedy to those who glimpse it. Others believe it guards something lost to time, but the oldest stories, the ones only whispered by candlelight, say that if you follow the sound, if you chase the thunder through the mist, you will never be seen again. Ethan Grayson didn't believe in ghost stories. He had spent his life rolling his eyes at the superstitions of Briar Hollow, where every strange shadow was a spirit and every unlucky event was blamed on curses. But the horse? That story had always fascinated him, not because he believed it, but because too many people did. Hunters, travelers, even his own grandfather, all swore they had heard it, seen the trails left in the morning dew where no horse had passed. Ethan wanted proof. So on the night of the first autumn fog, he took his lantern and walked to the fields alone. The air was thick with mist, swallowing the trees, muffling the world around him. The only sound was his own breath, the crunch of damp grass beneath his boots. Then, the first hoofbeat, faint, distant. Ethan froze. A second beat, a third, then a rapid gallop, growing louder, closer. He turned, raising the lantern high, but there was nothing, only the swirling fog. And yet, the hoofbeats did not stop. They circled him, faster and faster, as if something unseen ran just beyond his reach. Then a gust of wind tore through the mist, and for a split second, he saw it. A massive black stallion, mane wild, eyes burning like embers, charging straight toward him. Then, gone. The hoofbeats vanished. The night fell silent. The lantern in Ethan's shaking hand flickered. He took a step back, heart hammering, and that was when he saw the hoofprints, perfectly formed in the damp grass, leading deeper into the mist. "You're a fool for going out there." Ethan glanced up from his untouched breakfast. His grandfather, Thomas Grayson, stared at him across the table, deep lines creasing his weathered face. "You heard it, didn't you?" the old man asked. Ethan hesitated. Then slowly, he nodded. A shadow passed over his grandfather's expression. He set down his coffee cup with a heavy sigh. "You should count yourself lucky," he said. "Most who see the horse don't come back the same." Ethan frowned. "You don't actually believe the stories, do you?" His grandfather's eyes were dark, serious. "I've lived in this valley for 70 years, boy," he said. "I've heard that beast run since I was younger than you." Ethan scoffed. "It's just an old myth." His grandfather's face hardened. "You ever wonder why no one rides it?" Ethan blinked. Thomas leaned forward. "Because it once had a rider," he said, "and he was taken by whatever curse that horse carries." Ethan swallowed. His grandfather sat back, gaze distant. "You've heard the stories," he muttered, "but you don't know the truth." He looked Ethan in the eye. "That horse was once a living thing, a champion of these lands. And the man who rode it, he was the pride of Briar Hollow." He exhaled. "Until the night he tried to outrun death. 200 years ago, there was a rider named Elias Mercer. He was a legend in Briar Hollow, known for his speed, his skill, and his bond with his horse, a black stallion named Shadowmere. No one could beat them. No one could catch them. But Elias was arrogant. He believed no force in this world could outrun him. Not man, not storm, not even fate. And so, when a traveling soothsayer came to town, whispering of a race no man had ever won, Elias laughed. He challenged fate itself, and fate answered. On the night of the mist, Elias rode out to the fields, and something waited for him. No one knows what he raced against. Some say it was the devil himself. Others say it was death. But what is certain is this: Elias never crossed the finish line. At the first light of dawn, his horse returned, foam-flecked and wild-eyed. But Elias was not on its back. His body was never found. Only his horse remained, running, forever caught in the race it could never finish. And so, on nights when the mist rolls in, The horse still runs, still searches for a rider who will finish the race, for someone foolish enough to try. Ethan couldn't get the story out of his head. He wasn't afraid, but he was curious. What if there was some truth to it? What if the phantom horse was more than just a ghost story? And what if, just maybe, it was waiting for someone to ride it again? So on the next misty night, Ethan returned to the fields. This time, he didn't just listen. He ran toward the sound. The hooves thundered. The mist churned. And then, it appeared. The great black stallion standing before him, watching. Ethan's breath caught. It was real. And then, it knelt, as if waiting. His heart pounded. Slowly, he reached for the mane. And the moment he touched it, the world vanished. He was no longer in Briar Hollow. The mist was gone. The stars above him were wrong. The ground beneath him was endless black, stretching into eternity. And ahead, a shadowed figure waited on horseback. Silent, still. Then it turned, and with a snap of the reins, the race began. The phantom horse leapt forward, Ethan on its back, the wind screaming past. The world blurred. The rider ahead never slowed, never looked back. Ethan gritted his teeth. He had to win, had to finish, had to. The rider turned, and Ethan saw his face, his own face, a mirror image, mouth open in a silent scream. And he understood. No one had ever won the race. No one ever would. Because the moment you rode the phantom horse, you became its rider, and the race would never end. Never. And in Briar Hollow, on misty nights, the hoofbeats still echo, still run, still search for the next fool to take the reins.